Another term for drilled piers would be helical piers. That's probably the more common term, but sometimes they just see that they're being drilled into the ground, and so they're a drilled pier. And so the differences between, say, a drilled pier or helical pier and something that sometimes is referred to as a pressed piling, which is a hydraulically pushed pier into the ground, is the technique that they're installed. So a drilled pier or a helical pier tends to be installed by an excavator or sometimes a skid steer. So there's attachments that you can add to those pieces of machinery that will hydraulically drill the engineered drilled pier or helical pier into the ground that's ultimately engineered to hold the load. And then a pressed pier, which is a push pier, is driven in by hand through what's called a hydraulic ram. So it's a handheld, essentially. It sits by the installer. It's maybe 12 inches by 24 inches. It's a small box that hydraulically pushes those piers down the ground, ultimately in segments, so much smaller segments because the machinery is smaller. So those segments in a pressed pier or pushed pier tend to be 24 inches long, where a drilled pier or helical pier will tend to be up to 3 feet long. They're longer, but they got more power behind the installer or the machinery that's ultimately installing them. But it's really the machinery that's used. So the larger the machinery that's used could be a helical pier or a drilled pier, and then the handheld boxes, which are also hydraulically pushed into the ground, tend to be a little bit shorter. At KC Pier, we will push piers. So we'll do the pressed pier technique and we'll use the hydraulic rams. We do everything by hand. We concentrically load our pier, which we think from a structural principle is much more structurally sound, which is why we can put lifetime warranties behind all our structural repairs that we do at KC Pier. So we adhere to what we consider more structurally sound principles to give customers a lifetime solution. We'll do and work with helical piers every once in a while, or drilled piers, but we do that with tends to be new construction, or if ultimately there are types of applications where pressed piers or push piers just simply can't be used, and so we have to use a drilled pier. But we don't necessarily believe in using a drilled pier in all applications like some companies do. They do it for expense and savings, and so we have other techniques where we think our concentrically loaded push pier is a much more stronger sound and lifetime warranted solution than others. So there's reasons for both, but we tend to take kind of the high road and produce quality repairs that last a lifetime that we feel customers appreciate. And so we can look at it from both perspectives, but we always tend to give options, and so those options are things that we'll ultimately talk through with customers when we do our structural repairs.